Welcome to NEXTGames video on how to solo the fight, One to be Feared. This fight has two phases. In the first, you go against Omega, and in the second, you go against Ultima. I'm using my usual set of followers for this one. Your N keeps me alive and is great for removing enfeebles from me quickly. Korumoru for haste and extra cures. Ulmia for March. Cell helps continually restore hit points, magic points, and TP to the party. And lastly, Shantoto 2 is great for SCs and MBs. In Phase 1, we will go against Omega. Almost all of his TP moves are AoE, and some can hit very hard. Let's take some time to go over them before the fight starts. So these are all of Omega's main abilities. We'll go from top to bottom here. The first three are the least dangerous to you. The first one is called Ion Efflux. This one is an AoE move, but it only goes in a Kono formation, so that means basically directly in front of the mob. And therefore, as long as your back is to a wall or something, it's not going to hit any of your trust. It also inflicts paralyze to you, but your end usually gets that off you very quickly. The next one is called Guided Missile. This one is also an AoE in a Kono direction, so therefore, as long as your trust are to the sides or rear of Omega, they won't get hit with it. And this one's absorbed by shadows, so as long as you have 2 or 3 shadows up, you won't take any damage at all. If you don't have those shadows up, you'll take about 750 damage. The third one is called Target Analysis. This one actually doesn't do any damage to you, but it does drain attributes from everyone around Omega, including your trust. So this one's also absorbed by shadows, which is good because you really don't want him gaining much attributes through this ability. The next two moves are Hyper Pulse and Rear Lasers. Hyper Pulse is an AoE move, so it's going to hit everyone around Omega. It'll inflict weight and bind, and the most dangerous thing is it's going to do anywhere from 500 to 1,000 damage to each person. Especially for your trust, this is the most dangerous move because some of them only have barely that many hit points to begin with. Rear Lasers is one that we'll exclusively use when the person who has hate is behind him. It's also an AoE move, so it'll hit everyone around him, but it's also going to stone people. And this actually can basically immediately end your fight if your end cannot get that off of you quickly, because you're basically just a sitting duck for up to 30 seconds. And usually by that time he will end up finishing both your shadows and your hit points off. That one, as well as petrifying you, is also going to do 500 to 1,000 damage. So you want to avoid being behind Omega and drawing hate, or he will use that move. The next of Omega's moves we're going to talk about is his most dangerous one, which is called Pile Pitch. He most frequently uses this once he gets underneath 75% hit points, and uses it quite frequently all the way down to 25%. It's his only non-AoE move, so it'll only affect the person that he uses it on. But it will reduce that person's hit points to 5% of their total, so that usually leaves them between 100 and 200 hit points. It will bind them and reset hate. So as the white mage tries to cure this person who this move was just used on, Omega usually tears off towards that person and tries to basically kill them before the tank can get hate back. The main way that Ninja deals with this is through the use of Migawari. If Migawari is up, it will negate all 3 of those effects. It won't reset hate, it won't bind you, and it won't do any damage to you. So the key to this fight is keeping Migawari up the entire time. Now there may be some instances to where he will use Pile Pitch back to back. So during those instances you very well may lose, or that second one may hit you, causing you to lose hate. So you always want to make sure you have Provoke ready to pull him off of your white mage as your white mage tries to cure you back up after this move hits you. Also very important with this move is always keeping shadows up, so that if it does hit you, you aren't vulnerable to be taken out on the next melee swing by Omega. This last move is one of Omega's most annoying features, and that is that underneath 25% hit points, he gains access to an ability called Discharger. This basically doesn't do any damage to your party directly, but does give Omega shock spikes, which makes it so that each time you hit him with one of your weapons, you will get stunned for up to about 5 seconds. This will dramatically slow down your fight, so once you hit 25% hit points, the key to Omega is finishing him as quickly as possible. One last note on Discharger is that When you are stunned, you will have a very small window between when stun wears off and your next melee round, making it so that you can get stuck in a perpetual melee loop with the inability to either weapon skill or get shadows back up. So if you want to do either of those two things, you want to be hitting the macro repeatedly while you are stunned, so that you hopefully can do one of those two things in that small window of time between when you're stunned and when you're doing your next melee round, which will inevitably stun you once again. Okay, so now that we've discussed all of Omega's moves, let's now go ahead and show you how this fight looks on both normal and difficult difficulties. To start, I'm simply putting up Gaka for an enmity boost and activating Yonin. I then start with a Urine to lower Omega's TP gain, since so many of his abilities are AoE moves that could hurt my party. You then want to pull him to the side of the ship quickly and tank him with your back to the side of the ship so that all of the TP moves, especially the conal ones that he uses, hit only you and not your trust. I'm going to notice here that Uran's going to run behind me. This is because I'm kind of moving around the ship here. In hindsight, I definitely should have been on Omega's other front foot so that Uran wouldn't get hit by any of his conal moves. On the plus side, that hyper pulse that Omega just did didn't hit Uran because he was behind me, so it actually ended up working out in this instance. But does go to show you that if you move around, your trusts are obviously going to move around, and you may put them in danger because of the conal attack, so you do want to take care. Omega is now below 25% hit points. We want to finish him as soon as possible so that he cannot use discharge. Fortunately, in this example, he decides to use Pile Pitch back to back, which does end up resetting Hate, but is much easier dealt with than a discharge. I wanted to show an example of a slightly different party configuration. In this one, you aren't the tank, but instead are going to primarily just focus on dealing damage. So we actually end up bringing in two tanks, since Omega has the ability to one-shot either of them. I have brought in both August and Gesho in place of Seth and Shankoto. Gesho's good because he has shadows that block some of Omega's abilities, and August is excellent at keeping Hate. The main issue with this setup, though, is that you don't have a lot of control over the positioning of Omega, which may make it so that some of your trust are being hit by moves that they would not normally otherwise be getting hit by. Fight, I started doing so much damage that I have pulled Hate away from August. Normally I would turn around and let August get Hate back, but at this point we have just passed the 25% hit point mark for Omega, so we need to finish him off as soon as possible. Therefore, I just stay in the fight and try and do as much damage as I can as quickly as possible. In this third and final example of an Omega fight, I switched the difficulty level to difficult, and I'm using the same tanking party from my previous example. The goal here was to simply have Gesho and August tank while I did as much damage as quickly as possible, understanding that probably both of them would be dead by about 25 to 50% of Omega's hit points, and that I would need to tank the remainder of the fight. Sadly, it didn't quite go as expected, but you'll see some examples here of some things that can go wrong. First, August dies immediately at the start of the fight because a hyper pulse goes off before Yoran can get buffs up. Normally this actually would have wiped more people in the party than it did, so I was actually a little lucky here. Yoran is still trying to buff the party and cure us from that hyper pulse attack when Omega sends off a guided missile ability that ends up finishing off both Koru and Ultima with 1500 damage to each. This makes it so only Gesho, Yoran, and myself are left to finish the 95% of hit points that Omega has left. Normally this would be bad, but in this example it actually works out. The main reason for this is because Omega's abilities are primarily AoE, and Yoran at this difficulty level cannot keep up with keeping everyone cured. But when there's only 3 people in the party, he has a much easier time keeping up with the AoE abilities. So if you are having difficulty beating Omega on this difficulty level, I suggest going with a smaller party size to see if that will give you better results. Okay, we're going to move on to Ultima's TP moves. The first one we're going to go over is Particle Shield. This is the one that you hope he uses the most, because all it really does is give him a defense bonus that isn't really that noticeable. The rest of his moves are actually pretty damaging, and most of them are AoE, so we can hope he uses Particle Shield as many times as possible in your fight. The next move that is least dangerous to you is called Wire Cutter. It's a single target move, so it doesn't hit any of the trust around you, and it's absorbed by your shadows, so normally it's going to bounce right off of you. However, if it does hit you or a trust, it's going to hit them or you for 1500 to 2000 damage. The next move that is least dangerous, I will say, is Antimatter. This is also a single target, and the last of his non-AoE moves. But the dangerous part about this is it's going to ignore your shadows entirely. So it won't wipe them, but it will go right past them and hit you and do 1500 to 2000 damage. So because of those last two moves I mentioned, you really want to have at least 2000 hit points in your setup, in your gear setup when you're fighting this. Otherwise, you do stand the chance of being one-shotted by either of those two moves. The rest of Ultima's TP moves are all AoEs. The only one of them that is not an AoE conal attack is the next one called Equalizer, and it's by far Ultima's most dangerous. It will usually do upwards of 1500 damage to anyone within 15 feet around him. This is usually enough to take out at least one or two of your trust. The main defense against this is to summon trust with higher hit points, and to summon your white mage as far down in the order as possible, usually last, so that they are as far away from you as possible. That person is usually just out of range enough so that they do not get hit with it. The rest of Ultima's TP moves are all very similar in nature. They are all AoE conal attacks that will only affect players directly in front of him. They will all ignore your shadows and do roughly 1500 damage. Additionally, each one will inflict you with a different negative status ailment that Yoran will need to get off of you. It is very important that for this entire fight you keep Migawari up, so that if any of these moves ends up criticaling and doing a high amount of damage to you, it will be negated by your Migawari. The last thing I'll mention is that after Omega you are free to resummon any of your trust that may have died during the Omega fight, or if any of your mages are low on MP, go ahead and dismiss and then resummon them to quickly get them back to full MP. So now let's see how the Ultima fight goes with those two different party setups we discussed earlier when defeating Omega. Here's the first example of the Ultima fight. In this one, I am the only tank. This is the way I prefer to do it. I'm going to go ahead and pull him to the side of the ship and make sure that he's not facing any of your trust, and get to work. Okay, so now let's show you the normal mode tank setup for this. Go ahead and use this setup if you're not comfortable tanking, or if you're just more geared for a DD setup. In this example, you're using August and Gesho as our tanks again. Know that at any point Ultima can one-shot either of these two guys, so you need to be ready to hop in there and tank in the event later on in the fight they do go down. spot, you see Geshem here take almost 2,000 points of damage from the high tension discharger. It'll of course one-shot him. That's exactly what I'm referring to when I'm saying your tanks will probably die during this fight. There's nothing we can really do about that, so just know that when you do go with this setup, again, you are going to have to probably inevitably tank sometime during the fight. You're just trying to get as much damage in as you can before both tanks go down, so that you have the easiest time as possible with the last part of the fight once they do go down. This is the third and final example of the Ultima fight. In this one we are on the difficult difficulty level, using the same tank setup we did for the difficult level for Omega. But similar to that fight, we're going to see that the Trust just aren't able to keep up with the damage output of Ultima and will quickly die. This will leave Yoran to keep me alive. And similar to Omega, this will actually make Yoran's job easier, as it's pretty difficult to keep all of these Trust alive with the amount of AoE moves that occur during this fight. So that should be it. I hope you all found that helpful. I'm going to put the pieces of gear you can get from this battlefield up on the screen here. The most important one for Ninja is a C-Sans earring. That is definitely a great item in that slot, especially for TP gain. So I would definitely recommend getting that for anyone working on a Ninja build similar to my own. Hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Take care.